Not too long ago, Dr. Justin Bronk from the Royal United Services Institute brought out a new report on the current situation in Ukraine concerning air defense and also, of course, the activities by the Ukrainian Air Force and the Russian Aerospace Forces, or the VKS. Justin doesn't really require another introduction on the channel, but he's been a regular since, well, summer of last year. So I thought, you know what, let's just dive right into it, talk with him about the current situation in Ukraine, what are the challenges there, and how can NATO assist Ukraine at this juncture. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. So Justin, thanks very much for being back on the channel. Based on your report, it seems that now we can credit the VKS with a lot more activity than we assumed they were carrying out in the beginning stages, and then to the midterm stages, and now into, of course, the winter months as well, in the Ukrainian-Russian conflict. But at the same time, they do seem to face quite enormous challenges in penetrating Ukrainian airspace due to the ground defenses. So to break up that riddle, how would you go about explaining that?
So the Russian Air Force essentially has a very high degree of technical overmatch against the Ukrainian Air Force in terms of the aviation components, so the fast jets. But the Russian Air Force has serious limitations in terms of its ability to, first of all, to do suppression and destruction of enemy air defenses in small formations. Their munitions for the task are, broadly speaking, limited to anti-radiation missiles, but also they face a systemic issue, which is that they don't really have the pilot competence, experience, and also the planning capacity, probably because the planners used to be pilots and therefore don't have that experience and competence from their days as pilots, to run large combined air operations in terms of big mixed formations with different sorts of aircraft, covering each other's strengths and weaknesses and kind of being brought together into something that's greater than the sum of its parts. It's the secret sauce, as it were, of Western, particularly American air power, is the ability to bring together lots of different types, sequence them up with the tankers, the enablers, but also the very complex air tasking order, all the planning, briefing, sequencing, actually flying the thing and then debriefing and kind of doing battle damage assessment and getting it ready to spin up all over again. That's an incredibly complicated, complex thing to do that takes a huge amount of practice. And the Russians just have never really operated like that. So when in the first 3 days of the war, when the Russian electronic warfare had very effectively suppressed the Ukrainian ground-based air defenses, and in conjunction with that, the strikes from cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and also fixed-wing airstrikes were all being concentrated against air defense sites. So even the Ukrainian ground-based air defense assets that weren't moving, that weren't suppressed, were moving, because they were having to rapidly reposition to avoid being hit and destroyed by these various strikes. Even the ones that weren't essentially blinded or even damaged by electronic attack were having to continually reposition to avoid those strikes. The Russians' ability to detect and report target locations is not matched by an ability to rapidly pass that through the targeting cycle and update their strikes. So as long as Ukrainians kept moving, they lost relatively few assets to physical strikes. Most that they did lose were down in the south, where they got much less warning, but also a lot of the systems had significant serviceability issues with trailers, for example, for S300 PS and PT, as well as things like SA3, which are not really mobile. So there was some physical destruction there, limited up in the north, but for that first 3 days, because of that mix of EW and having to continually reposition, and also then repair and reset radars that had been badly jammed or even damaged, the Ukrainian Air Force was kind of left holding its own on its own. Particularly for the first 2 days. By the third day, the Ukrainian GBAD is starting to come back up. And so what you see is this contrast in VKS effectiveness between when they're not facing a Ukrainian GBAD threat in terms of radar-based GBAD, so SA-11, so Book, SA-8 OSA, S300 PSPT V1. When those are not active, the Russian Air Force actually has a great deal of freedom. They're still mostly hitting fixed targets, They're using a lot of unguided bombs as well as quite a lot of standoff missiles, air-launched, maritime and also ground-launched. On the one hand, when the GBAD isn't active, the VKS has a great deal of overmatch and therefore a great deal of freedom to operate at medium altitude and higher. So if you operate above about 10,000 feet, you're relatively safe as a fast jet from MANPADS, so shoulder-fired MANPADS. Above 15,000 feet, you're completely safe. And so when that radar guided threat was down, they were operating a lot of medium altitude strike sorties and high altitude fighter caps. As soon as that GBAD starts coming back up, that ground-based air defense coverage, the inability to do effective CAD-DIAD and to coordinate large, mutually supporting and self-escorting strike packages just isn't really there in the Russian Air Force and aerospace forces, and so they rapidly lose the ability to operate at medium and high altitude over Ukrainian-controlled territory. So then they try and go very low. When they go very low, the SAM range is much reduced because of the impact of clutter and the curvature of the Earth. It limits how far radars can see, but at the same time it means they're right down in that MANPADS envelope, so they're suddenly starting to take a lot of losses there. Interesting, Ukrainians also taking losses from MANPADS, and both sides taking losses from their own MANPADS, because a MANPADS does not have IFF, so identification friend or foe. Troops tend to shoot at what they see. That was more of a problem for the Ukrainian side than it was for the Russian side, because the Russians initially were under orders to assume anything flying was Russian. But yeah, so being down low in the MANPADS envelope is very difficult. And since then, until so far at least, till this point, the Russian Air Force has essentially been neutered by the fact that it can't operate sustainably in Ukrainian airspace because it can't do that CAD-DIAD job. So it can't sustainably find and kill the Ukrainian mobile SAMs. And therefore, if it does try and penetrate, it has to be very low, where it consistently takes unacceptable losses to MANPADS. The flip side, and the point of that report of this report, is to say that there's no guarantee that that stays the case if those Ukrainian SAMs, which are still slowly being attrited, particularly by Orlan-10 UAVs and artillery or loitering munitions, if those are not resupplied with ammunition and eventually sort of augmented and ultimately replaced by new tactical SAMs, then the VKS could once again be in a position to be highly effective, because without the GBAD, as I said, they overmatch Ukrainian fighters to a very great degree.
Before I go towards the fighters, just for the MANPADS, is it still so that the Ukrainians are mainly using sort of the old, Eastern systems and not, let's say, FIM-92 Stingers and so on? Because I was under the impression that FIM-92 does have IFF, but is it an issue of syncing it up with the Russian or the old Eastern aircraft systems?
I imagine it'd be fairly difficult even for models of Stinger that, for example, that do have an IFF capability or an interrogate capability. I'm not aware that I don't know how that works. I haven't looked into Stinger in huge detail. But if it does have an IFF capability, it will probably be synchronized to NATO standard IFF. And indeed, the normal target set would be MiG-29, Sukhoi 27, Mil-8, Mil-28, Mil-24 and 35. So exactly the things the Ukrainians and the Russians are flying. So I imagine the IFF wouldn't be terribly reliable in that case.
The disparity between what the Ukrainian Air Force and the Russian Air Force is flying, I mean, is this a technological disparity in terms of the radar that's being used, the missile ranges, and sort of the option that those capabilities bring? Or are there also deeper grounded problems in the sense that Ukraine has issues with resupplying their stocks of ammunitions or spare parts for their aircraft?
So the technical disparity comes down to a few things in fighter terms. So from a radar point of view, the modern flanker variants that the Russians are using, particularly Su-30SM or the SM-2, which is slightly more modernized and has the upgraded radar, same as the Sukhoi 35 with the other main air superiority type, which is the Urbis-E. Both those radars, the BARS and the Urbis-E, are much higher powered than the older radars that the Ukrainian MiG-29s and Sukhoi 27s are using. They are more sophisticated. They have greater functionality. They benefit from more modern software, more modern components. They also have much greater track while scan, much more developed track while scan capabilities. So the ability to lock up and interrogate a target and potentially guide a missile to it without putting it in a single target track lock. So normally with a fighter radar, if you put something in an STT lock, that basically focuses all the energy of the radar in a beam at that target. So you get a very, very high resolution. It allows you to get very good data on bearing, track, speed. Because it's such concentrated radar energy and it's not sweeping back and forth, it's just locked to you, it's very easy for even quite old radar warning systems to recognize. So essentially, if you're in a fighter aircraft and someone puts you in an STT lock, you will get a very definite warning that that is the case, and identification of what they are and what bearing they're on. In some more modern systems, you might even get range information off that over time. So in a track while scan engagement, you can just focus a little bit of additional energy on each target. And so first of all, it's much less likely to alert them that you're locking them up, while still giving potentially enough resolution for missile guidance, although not terminal guidance generally. But it also allows you to lock multiple targets at once rather than a single one, and to keep scanning for other things to keep your situational awareness up while you conduct engagements. Hence, track while scan. You can track targets while continuing to scan. And that means that the target in question may not even know that they're being engaged. They may not know they're being locked, and they also won't get a missile guidance warning until the moment that that seeker head goes active, which at that point is only a few seconds away from impact. When that seeker head does go active, the fighter doing the guidance can then turn away. It's a combination of from a radar point of view, the range is much better for Russian fighters compared to the Ukrainian ones. They can engage with Ukrainian fighters without necessarily giving the Ukrainian pilots any warning that they're being directly locked up. Whereas Ukrainian pilots, to conduct an engagement, they have to lock up a Russian aircraft in such a way as they will get an immediate warning in the cockpit and an ID of what direction it is and what type of aircraft. And from a missile guidance point of view, the Ukrainians, when they launch, that will give a launch warning, audible launch warning to the Russian pilots, and it will also require the Ukrainians to keep nose hot, to keep a constant single target track lock on the Russian aircraft for the entire engagement. Otherwise, the missile will miss. Whereas the Russians, they can fire an active seeker missile, and then once the missile seeker goes active, they can turn away and just forget about it and maneuver as they wish. But equally, if they lose guidance midway through the engagement, if it's close enough, the missile may actually, when it goes active, still find the target. So it doesn't even mean that you necessarily miss, even if you have to break lock earlier in an engagement for a brief period. You probably would need to update it, and they may not have the data link functionality to do that, but there's a lot of advantages. The Russian radar is also much higher powered and have better burn-through performance, so against noise jamming. The missiles themselves, in addition to the active versus semi-active advantage, the Russian R-77 comfortably outranges the Ukrainian R-27, and also the R-37 massively outranges both of them. Coupled with the fact that the Ukrainians are having to fly low anyway, because of the range disparity and because they're so outnumbered and because of the Russian ground-based air defense laydown, that also greatly affects range, because a missile that is fired low, from low altitude and relatively low speed, you will be slower down there as well, will not only start with less energy, it will then have to climb against, while its motor is burning, against a higher flying target, which means that it will, when the motor burns out, it will have very little energy left, because instead of starting high and fast and then using all of that energy just to accelerate and perhaps gain a bit of extra height, it's starting very low and slow and having to try and accelerate while climbing. As a general rule, the motor will burn for, depends on the missile, but somewhere between about 6 and 10 seconds. And any energy after that is just it coasting. And once a missile gets below the target's own speed, it will almost never hit, because the plane is powered, so it's continually moving and maneuvering, and the missile is having to try and make maneuvers with what speed it has left, either during the motor burn or afterwards. And so yeah, effective range will be massively lower if you're firing from low and slow versus something that's high and fast. even if you have the same missile. So yeah, there's a huge degree of disparity there. And a final aspect would be, apart from being outnumbered, and also the Russians generally having AWACS support, so A50 M or U, which means that they will generally know roughly where the Ukrainians are from the moment they take off. Ukrainians don't have that luxury most of the time. They might get some warning from either ground-based radars or partner forces, but they don't have nearly the same resolution or coverage. And then also there's EW, so electronic warfare. The Russians generally fly with wingtip Kuzmin pods, so electronic warfare pods. Those are very effective in jamming Ukrainian radios, so intra-flight communications, so they often find it very difficult to communicate between each other, between wingmen, for example, or different formations in the air when there's Russian fighters about. And also the Kuzmin pods will lock onto and try and degrade Ukrainian radar performance, so further increasing that disparity. The one positive there is that the Kuzmin pods also interfere with the Russian radars and comms because they're not particularly well tested and integrated. So if one member of a flight of Russian fighters, let's say, has his Kuzmin pods on, then other members of the flight won't be able to use their radars particularly effectively because as they're scanning away, the Kuzmin pods will be locking onto and disrupting them.
And how much of this conflict now, if we sort of zoom out from the technical aspects, but how much of this conflict now is not necessarily a fight over air superiority? I mean, we can argue, of course, about temporary or local air superiority, but rather it has become, in its current form, a sort of a stalemate of aerial denial.
Yeah, both sides have, largely speaking, denied each other the ability to effectively employ air power. It's not complete denial in that both sides are using air power. Russia, in particular, is using fighter patrols very effectively to push Ukrainian close air support or strike sorties away from the front lines. They're able to operate high and fast with long-range radars and long-range missiles quite close to the Ukrainian front lines, not crossing over them, but that means they can project a threat range against low-flying Ukrainian ground attack aircraft or fighters quite a long way beyond the front lines inside Ukrainian airspace. So they're able to deny Ukraine, using their fighters as a use of air power, the ability to support their own troops by conducting airstrikes. There's also, of course, the Russian ground-based air defense laydown, which is still highly effective and very lethal. So the Ukrainians generally flying very low. The Ukrainians, for their part, they are still trying to conduct strikes, mostly standoff rocket lobbing, but that's the ability to reasonably accurately, depending on how well planned and flown the sortie is, and they use ballistic calculators and things to work out how to lob things, but it's essentially flying artillery. It's adding to the responsive power of Grad type artillery. It's not much more than that. Russians are doing that too, of course, with their Su-25s for the same kind of impact. But the Ukrainians are also using their fighters for counter-cruise missile and counter-Shahid 136 patrols inside Ukraine. So they are conducting defensive counter-air, as we would see it in counter-missile operations. In that sense, both sides are still employing air power, and also both sides are using helicopters to move a lot of stuff around.
What would sort of be in the immediate interest, let's say, of NATO countries in order to supply Ukraine? I mean, it seems very much that in the short term, the highest priority should be air defense systems. But working towards the long term, then at some point, has there to be a switch towards converting Ukraine in Air Force towards a Western-style fixed-wing jet?
Western priority on military support, I think, does have to include air defense aid quite urgently. And it's very gratifying to see, first of all, a large tranche of 1,000 additional short-range air-to-air missiles of various kinds from the UK a week and a half ago, and another announcement of anti-aircraft guns. I think those may be purchased from elsewhere and to be sent in. The UK doesn't have a huge number of anti-aircraft guns that would be advanced enough to be useful. And, interesting also to see the Americans pushing in Avenger. So basically Stinger mounted with a 50 cal on a Humvee very useful for counter-Shahid work, pushing in more NASAMS ammunition there as well. Germany reportedly stepping up, trying to push some more ammunition for the IRIS-T that they've sent out, which is working extremely well, albeit limited ammo. The urgency, I think, is difficult to overstate. So there's two different threats running concurrently, both of which require urgent air defense supplies like this on a sustained basis. The first of which is the threat against Ukrainian infrastructure. So about half of Ukrainian electricity generation is now down. Well, at least has been badly damaged. Now, obviously, there will be repair work ongoing on that, and so it's not just a case of trying to provide coverage against cruise missiles and ballistic missiles, the latter much more difficult to intercept, of course, but also Shahids against the remaining energy infrastructure, but also the need to protect the repair efforts. And there's a huge spread of stuff that they need to try and protect, so that's a big task. Even with huge amounts of air defense aid, there would still be a threat to Ukraine on the infrastructure, but it's about giving them enough on a sustained basis to make it inefficient or ineffective for the Russians to create the systemic effects across the whole country within the ammunition supplies they have. Because, of course, they don't have unlimited ammunition supplies. They're running pretty low on particularly that very high-end Iskander, 9M73. They can only produce about 6 a month, and their usage rate has been running way above that. And they're also running quite low on caliber. So yeah, there's a challenge there. And then there's also this counter VKS challenge, keeping the VKS, the Russian Air Force, back from the front lines, keeping them ineffective, stopping them operating at medium and high level over Ukrainian forces. And that's a different SAM challenge. You need things that are more mobile, probably shorter ranged. NASAMS is probably ideal for that, but the problem is the West doesn't have massive numbers of launchers. There isn't enough Western ground-based air defense to replace all of the Russian or Soviet origin equipment that the Ukrainian armed forces are relying on so far. So for a start, we need to keep working in the short to medium term on finding additional ammunition sources for those tactical SAMs. What's needed is something else that can be a threat in being that will force the Russian Air Force to stay back without relying on continually being able to fire large numbers of tactical SAMs. And that's where fighters come in. The Russian Air Force has been very, very cautious with pushing into Ukrainian missile defense zones. Where there is a threat, they generally stay back. And that's partly why their losses, while significant, confirmed losses are sitting around the low 60s. It's a lot of jets from an Air Force that started out with about 350 modern fast jets. They have a massive inventory in theory, but their actual modern fleets are much smaller. But part of the reason the losses have been low is that once they've taken losses in a given concept of operations, either first of all at medium level after the first 3 days when the SAM started to recover, didn't take them long to go low. It was only a few losses before they went low. And then when they went low, they tried it, they lost between 9 and 11 aircraft the first week of doing that, and then they gave up. So they went at night, and then they continued to lose a trickle of aircraft until they kind of gave up flying like night penetrations basically by the end of March. And then there's just been this sort of trickle of losses to MANPADS and to attacks on air bases and things. So all you would need to do is have a few successful engagements with a Western fighter fleet. So you could have really quite a small fleet, as long as it can move and disperse faster than the Russian targeting cycle can keep up with, which is what the Ukrainians have been doing with their jets. So it need to be robust, you need to be able to operate from relatively rough, relatively small strips with quite mobile, relatively light touch maintenance requirements. But if you can have a fleet like that that's just there that the Russians can't sustainably target, with a long-range missile, ideally the European Meteor, just because it's got such a greater effective range than AMRAAM, especially if it's launched lower and slower than the target, because it's got a ramjet motor, so it gets power through much, much more of its flight profile, and hence it's got a lot more energy when it's getting to the terminal phase than AMRAAM, or maybe AMRAAM Delta, but that's quite sensitive, both of them are. But all you would need is a couple of engagements, I suspect, 2 or 3 maybe, to inflict losses on Russian caps that previously thought they were operating at a safe distance. And at that point, I think you'd see them pull back quite far. They don't seem to have the stomach for sustained losses. So while putting in place the maintenance and logistics requirements for a large Western fighter fleet to replace most of the jets the Ukrainians are currently operating is clearly something that would be very difficult. It would take a long time, and it's probably not something that can be fully done before there's some sort of ceasefire. Something in the interim, and hence going back to something like the Saab Gripen, just because the Swedish built the Gripen from the ground up for exactly this sort of concept of operations, dispersed operations from small strips with small teams with vehicle-bound maintenance. It's very easy to service. It can carry Meteor. It's got a good internal electronic warfare suite to degrade Russian radar performance that's specifically geared to work against Russian radars because that's their pacing threat. It's not something, given the global supply, that could replace all of Ukraine's air capabilities within a year or two. You'd need a long time to do that. And in any case, I think the Ukrainians want to run a split fleet at some point anyway, with a light fighter and a heavy fighter, the heavy one to have more endurance for internal DCA. But as a way to keep the VKS back and kind of be that threat in being at a small scale for a specific purpose, it seems to me the solution that makes sense.
I mean, we'll see what the eventual solution to that will be. Justin, thank you very much for sharing your expertise. And of course, if anybody is interested, and I think everyone is interested, do check out the description as well for the report that you recently offered together with your colleagues. Thank you very much, Justin.
Thanks.
Hope you enjoyed that. As always, big thank you to patrons and channel members for making this content possible. Make sure you check out the description for some helpful links and Justin's recommendations. And as always, have a great day and see you in the sky.